Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Wondering Christians podcast. On today's episode, we are going to be covering homosexuality. This is the third episode, I believe, on human identity and sexuality. Before, we have covered marriage and divorce, and last time we covered abortion. So just diving into it really, I think we should spend some time defining what homosexuality is within the context of the 21st century. Just diving in, I would say that really homosexuality is something that people at least in the Western culture, would argue is a condition that they are born with, where they are inclined to have sexual attraction towards members of their own sex. So a male will want to have romantic interaction or sexual interaction with another male, and a woman would want to have sexual interaction with another woman. So do you have anything else to add to that, really? I mean, I would also add on, to be honest, that throughout the past few decades, probably since the 1960s in the UK and the United States, there has been a major push and major changes in laws and changes in Western philosophical thinking through matters of the place of marriage and childbearing and so on. So do you have anything else to add on that, Gomes?
I mean, this is such a vast issue, I think. It seems like it's just one little topic, but it touches on so many things, like you said, marriage, even just human identity and psychology. I was watching a debate a few days ago between a Baptist pastor, and a Church of England bishop, the Bishop of New Jersey or New York, I think, the state in the United States. And even the person defending homosexuality was saying that the science isn't so clear on if they are born with that innate attraction to the same sex or not. So I think we can go into those things deeper in a bit, but I mean, there's so many terms and there's so much science being done around this, and genetics and sociology, statistical work to find out what these people, what homosexuals are like, and to understand this nature of humanity and even other animals better. We're going through a phase, because it's so liberalized now, homosexual people and homosexuality and the behavior, it's so liberalized that it's out in the public sphere. And
it's commonly accepted.
Yeah.
Of kind of like the gay script, shall we call it, is commonly accepted.
Yeah, it's commonly accepted. People have interacted with homosexual people, and because it's so liberalized and this is happening, people are now forced to try and discover what is kind of a new facet of human life. It's always existed, definitely, but it's been hidden for a long time. Forcibly or not, it's been hidden. And it's only in the past 20, 30 years that even in the past 10 years, that people have really began to open up to these things more.
I'm just going to throw a curveball in there. And I don't know where to start really with it, whether to start scientifically or whether to start historically. I think I'm going to start historically. So throughout history, especially ancient history, there have been a ton of examples of homosexual acts being practiced throughout society. In fact, I'm not sure whether you know this, but in ancient Rome and Greece, in those societies, homosexual acts were actually considered to a higher degree than heterosexual acts in many ways. When I say that, I also more mean between two men as opposed to two women, because women were seen as inferior. So the societies were very much based around, so the male was kind of like the centre figure, and then off from the male you'd kind of have the women and then the children in kind of like acts of inferiority. And in fact, homosexuality was considered best to perform with young men and boys, as young boys and young men were said to be symbols of young masculine purity. And this was not something that was confined to specific individuals who were going about saying they were born with attractions towards men having attractions towards other men. This was, and these were acts that were participated in by a very large proportion of people, especially the wealthy. There's some evidence of this in Plato's Symposium. A gentleman called Aristophanes says some men are lovers of women, while others have an affection for men and embrace them. He adds that your character is revealed by what you love, and since men are superior to women, the conclusion is that lovers of men are superior to lovers of women. And he goes on to say that lovers of men are, quote, the best of boys and youths, because they have the most manly nature. They are valiant and manly, and have a manly countenance, and they embrace that which is like them, namely other men, close quote. And although Romans/Greeks saw man-to-man relations as superior to man and woman relations, it was actually man heterosexual relations, or acts that were allowed by law in marriage. Homosexual relations were not allowed in law by marriage. Isn't that interesting? That although homosexual acts between men was seen as symbolically superior, isn't it interesting that it was actually heterosexual relations that were protected in the law of marriage? And this was driven, supposedly, by the recognition that societies needed to give legal support and protection to that one relationship that was capable of having children. The reason why homosexual acts with young boys and young men was liked was because you'd have the dominant man and then the lesser dominant male, and the man that penetrated the male was seen as masculine, whilst the male being penetrated was seen as losing his masculinity and being dominated, almost as a form of BDSM, shall we call it. So just to conclude, in the ancient world, no sexual activity was considered poor, providing it was carried out in the very quite rather subjective notion called moderation.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that at all, and it's really eye-opening, because even those Asian people that fully accepted homosexual relationships, especially between men, they knew that that marriage was a union of a man of that was the union of a man and a woman, and it was a sacred thing, and the purpose of it was for family. And Christians nowadays, we do realize that two homosexuals can't have a family. God designed the family to be between a man and a woman, and the ancients also believed that, even though they accepted homosexual relationships outside of marriage. And it's not like they viewed the sexual relationships within marriage as more sacred. As you just said, the most sacred thing, the most sacred type of sexual relation would be between two men. So they're not really biased, I guess.
Yeah, well, many of the Caesars male lovers, and they were pretty public about it. The thing that strikes me is that seems to be like an affirmation of that people aren't born homosexual or heterosexual. There's always that option there to do one or the other. In fact, in modern society, there's plenty of stories of people, due to modern cultural pressures, coming out as gay, but then turning to, heterosexuality. And so you'd have lesbians and then having lesbians at first, and then they get married to a man. And they actually find out, although when they were younger, they were attracted to their other sex, mainly because of the philosophies of the secular world, they would actually end up having attractions to men as well, and men to women.
I had a friend like that. He was bullied in school for being ginger, basically, and a bit annoying, I guess. So one of the ways he found to cope with that, I think it was in year 8 or year 9, he decided to become bisexual, or just revealed that he was bisexual. And then I found out after a couple of years that he had just gone back to being heterosexual. He just used that as a coping mechanism and to try and stop being bullied by the other kids. That does happen. I mean, I think there are a couple things that can push a person to move to that side or to be homosexual. One can, I think it seems like some people might be born that way. And that's not against the biblical doctrine to say people can be born gay. I think that's possible. Maybe even the majority, I don't know. But some people are pushed into it because of social situations, as in my friend, because of bullying or etc., or they were molested as children, or they think it's cool or something like that. And it can also just be because of sexual depravity and sin. And they want to, and it's a perversion of God's order. So sin does change a person to do those types of things.
I'd quite like to raise a biblical verse here, actually. I believe it's John chapter 9, verse 1 through 3. And it says, "As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" And so what's happening is Jesus' disciples are asking him, because they are assuming that because this man was born blind, that one of his family members must have, or he himself must have sinned because they view this blindness as a punishment. But Jesus goes on to reply in John chapter 9, verse 3. It says, "Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." So I'll just say my opinion now, and my opinion is that I do not think that the majority of people are born homosexual. I think, however, I'm also saying that I don't believe the majority of people are born heterosexual. I think my personal opinion is that everyone is born with the potential to have attraction to women or to men.
That's an interesting take.
The reason I say this is because, and by all means correct me if you have a counter to it, but I do not believe that in the study of genetics that there aren't really any scientific proofs that specifically say that a person is going to be born homosexual. The only scientific study that I can think of is, I believe it's like MIH scans or something, those scans that they do of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is they have people who call themselves, who were attracted to the opposite sex, and they show them very attractive pictures of those of the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously these people will get aroused by this, and they pick up the brain activity of that arousal, and then they get some people in who are attracted to the same sex, and they do the same thing but with people of the same sex, and so with pictures of people of the same sex, I mean. So they would then record that they're sexually aroused by this. However, this goes no way anywhere near to say that people are born homosexual, it's just proving a point that's already there, is that, well, you can make yourself in a state by, I believe, nurture as opposed to nature. You can be in a state due to nurture, that you are attracted to people of the same gender. And I think this history that I've laid out actually is a good example of that, of actually the high value that homosexual acts were held in back in ancient Rome and ancient Greece and various other cultures. And I think there is a gay script behind this 21st century revival of homosexual acts. That being that when a person practices homosexual acts, they have then found their authentic self. Have you heard of this,
Yeah.
Lucas?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would you agree that this is openly pushed by multiple media channels?
Yeah, definitely.
And yeah, and yet when a person becomes heterosexual from so-called homosexual, then that's called homophobic, and they were never homosexual in the first place. ABCD.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that people these days are shaping their entire identity upon their sexual orientation. And that to me just seems really shallow and quite sad. And as you, Lucas, and the listeners probably remember as well from the previous episodes, we've been looking at this dualistic philosophy. And I'd say in regards to homosexuality, again, this dualistic philosophy re-emerges with a body/person divide, in the sense of you have the autonomous self and then you have the physical body. And instead of people loving their body and, I suppose, living in harmony with it, they instead see themselves as kind of like a machine controlling the body, and the body is subject to that. And they can do with the body as they wish.
This goes back to what we talked about in the introduction and the divorce episode and the abortion episode. It's these same ideas, and that's the point of this series as well. And along those lines of those other episodes as well, another thing that's been a fruit, another thing that's been a cause of what's happened in history and the divorce laws and the abortion laws, etc. It's this over-sexualizing of the culture. And even you talked about it in the divorce episode about the hookup culture. And it's all this over-sexualizing of the culture. And sadly, nowadays, it's the children as well. And that's why pedophilia is some people are talking about legalizing it, if you can even imagine that. And this whole idea of your identity is that if you like girls or if you like boys, it makes no sense. I mean, if you just look at this from a objective standpoint, why would you ever put your identity into that? You don't have a history. There's no homosexual history or anything like that. People, for example, do put their identity into the color of their skin, which doesn't really necessarily make some sense, but there's a lot of history behind that. If you're black in America, there's a lot of history that you've gone through, and it's all tied down to the color of your skin, etc. Here in Europe, there's not so much, but in America, for example, there is. That kind of makes sense, but just tying it to your orientation, it doesn't make too much sense at all. It's just, again, over-sexualizing. And the children are learning these types of things earlier and earlier on in their school lives. Talking about, going back to what you were talking about, how if people are born with it or not, and your opinion is that you're not really born with anything. You just learn from nurturing. Is that your opinion?
So I'll reiterate very quickly. I believe that, yeah, effectively that you're born neither necessarily heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual. I think these are all obviously man-made philosophical boxes that we try and put ourselves into. I think being informed by the science that I just laid out earlier, as well as the historical accounts of the place of homosexuality and homosexual acts, I believe that this is something that can be one way or the other. I believe that
Okay.
largely through nurture, yes, if you want to call it that, a person can be led to be more inclined to have same-sex acts or opposite-sex acts. I think that there are varying variables as to why a person would go with either one. I'm not totally, of course, ruling out the possibility that a person is born homosexual either. Even if that is the case, it doesn't really change anything.
Yeah. I think because mostly your humans only begin to have sexual attraction around puberty, if I'm not mistaken, unless they've been taught it or something. It's natural for a person to have sexual attraction starting from puberty, with all the chemicals going on in your brain and your body, testosterone, etc. But I can imagine also more effeminate men have. There might be a stronger correlation between effeminate men and homosexual men, I guess. That might be something, I don't know. But my opinion is, I think when God created Adam and Eve, he created them, and Adam loved Eve and Eve loved Adam, and the natural order was for a man to be attracted to a woman and a woman attracted to the man. However, because of the fall, sin entered the world and judgment along with it. So both things are natural. You see both things in nature. So from that standpoint, yes, homosexuality is natural, but it's still. But from a Christian standpoint, there's a different type of nature that we're talking about, and it's the nature that our parents were created with, Adam and Eve were created with, and that's not found in it. So I do believe people can be born homosexual, and that's just a result of God's judgment on humanity.
It's just a result of the fallen world that we live in. Like in John, the beginning verses of John chapter 9, when they ask about the blind man and who sinned for him to be blind, and Jesus said, well, no, he hasn't sinned, but this is nor have his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Well, we live in a fallen world at the end of the day, and things do go rather pear-shaped, however they can be used to display the works of God. There's actually a book called Living the Truth in Love, Pastoral Approaches to Same-Sex Attraction. And it tells the stories of people who either got married or stayed married, even though they had homoerotic feelings.
Yeah.
So these are testimonies of people who either thought they were born homosexual, as modern society screams all the time, or people who thought they were heterosexual but then began having homoerotic desires. If I might share a quote from a gentleman called Jeff Benion's story, it says, "In my 20s, I would have thought it was impossible that I could ever marry a woman, and even less possible that I would be happy and fulfilled in every way in that marriage. 11 years and counting now, and I am happier than ever. I don't blame people who doubt me. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I would find it dubious myself. It's so counter to the dominant cultural narrative out there." Again, and that was an example of a person who thought they were born homosexual. But then again, just to give a testimony of a gentleman who thought was heterosexual but then started having homoerotic desires. He says that over the years I have had passing thoughts of giving up my family and marriage for a same-sex relationship or partner, but decided that in no way is it worth destroying my family and marriage for that. I have created a family and children, and I have a responsibility to them that I could never forsake. So over time, even when feeling same-sex attraction, I have chosen not to dwell on it and to remain faithful to my marriage and family. I draw immense satisfaction from that. And I think really that is a hint of how our feelings are not what define us,
Yeah.
but our moral commitments do define us.
Yeah.
And we can find fulfillment when we find ways to live in congruence with our deepest commitments, really. But again, you know, it really sums down to it that the idea of marriage and sex, it's not what it's all about.
Yeah.
In Matthew chapter 19 verse 12, it goes on to say, if there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, the one who is able to receive this, receive it. And then again in Isaiah chapter 54 verse 1, it goes on as, sing, O barren one who did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labour. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. And I just think, wow, you know, this is a woman who cannot physically bear children, and yet it goes on to say, for the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says Lord. And, you know, it just goes on to say how this is a fallen world, and things are broken, and things are broken with us as human beings. However, we can learn to accept that in that we have been created this way, and we can still love our bodies and love ourselves for that. And also, although we may not have what we think we want, we can have so much more than that through the worship of God and through working for God.
Yeah.
But I think, do you have anything to say to that actually before I move on?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said. I think this idea of following your emotions, I mean, this has been really heavy since the romantic period, and it's really what this postmodern period goes and gets, as we talked about, as you actually said, I think, in a previous podcast. And everyone that lives in the 21st century is subject to this. And even I myself find myself sometimes thinking, okay, so what's the right choice? And even though sometimes I know what the right choice is, like, part of my mind has been programmed to follow what I think just feels best, and you know, what will satisfy my emotions the best. And I go and I choose that, even though I know it might not be the right choice. And it's crazy just how even someone that is aware of these things and postmodernist ideas and etc., everyone is influenced by them. And if you think you're not, you know, you might be more than you think. I also want to go back to what you said about the example with the guy that was blind from birth. I think it's that example, it's different because it's being blind isn't a sin, and it is a result of the fall. However, homosexuality is, and in my opinion, I'm still debating whether or not having homosexual attraction is sin or not. There are Christians, good Christians, that believe that you can be a Christian and carry on with homosexual attraction and deal with it and not let it, get a grasp of you, and not commit lust. But in the same way, heterosexual people shouldn't lust after the opposite sex anyways. However, I'm still debating this idea if it is a sin to just have that attraction or not. I think there does seem to be testimony from many Christians, and they do seem born again, and it does seem like they are born again and they carry on struggling with that, just as every other Christian struggles with other sins, problems that they have. However, I have to make reference to also Christians that are born again and they have little to no, they lose that sexual attraction and might be tempted to, might be reminded of that or feel that sporadically, but not so much live with that attraction. And there are people like that. There was a video that was put out in the 5th of January of last year on CBN, which is a Christian broadcast network. And they put it out. It's called Former LGBTQers Testify. If you no longer want to be gay or transgender, you don't have to be. And it's Christians talking about how God did work this change in them. So, yeah, I don't think it's just a result of the fall, like having cancer is a result of the fall. It's more than that. And I guess I'll go back to talk about God's wrath, and if we can turn to Romans 1:18, and I'll read. It talks about the wrath of God and homosexuality, so I'll read it. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and foolish in their hearts and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in their lusts and their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, and this is the point, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged their natural relations for those who are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And it carries on. I guess I can read it.
Just to throw another verse in there real quickly as well, that's directly related to that. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13, it says, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, and they shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. So it does go to show how appalling it is from the biblical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this is really clear because it says God, for this reason, because humanity worships the creature, fake gods, idolatry, people worship themselves, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. So this homosexual attraction, etc., it is a dishonorable passion, and it's more than just a result of the fall, because even Christians are still have to live with the consequences of the result of the fall. For example, death, sadness, all those things. But this is different. This is a dishonorable passion. So it is. So I do think that if people are born with it, going back to the initial question, if people are born with it, it's a result of God's wrath and judgment. So, yeah.
As a result of God's wrath and judgment.
I mean, this is what the text says. That's why I read it from the beginning. It begins with, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, and that suppress truth, etc." And it goes to and then it goes, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural relations." And it talks about the natural relations. So yeah, it is because it is sin. So at least if you engage in it.
Wait, is it saying that God gave them over because of their unnatural relations, or is it saying God, because He is wrathful, gave them unnatural relations?
No. It says.
Or did I mishear you terribly?
No. So it says that these unnatural relations. So homosexuality is a result of other things, of their an acknowledgement of who God is, and not worshipping Him. And it says, because all those, not worshipping Him, not worshipping God, comes before, and then it says, "For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions." Full stop. For their women exchange natural relations for those that are contrary to nature.
Yeah, I want to give some context to that as well. In the book of Hosea, it says, "For my people leave me for a lack of knowledge," and I think it's that lack of knowledge that really kind of like contributes to screwing people over as well. And that can lead them down that kind of like path. But we should really probably cover as to, even if you feel like you're born homosexual, there are, in Greek, there are 5 different kinds of love. So there's kind of like the love of, in regards to marriage and sexuality, and there's a specific love in regards to like friendship, and so it is like almost like a relationship between man and wife, but without the hokey pokey, shall we say?
I think there's eros, which would be the love between a man and a woman, or a wife and her husband, and then the philos, which would be that brotherly love. Philanthropy, for example. Philip comes from that, the name Philip. Then I think there's another one which I can't remember. Then there's agape, which is more of a charity love or a Christian love.
I think from a secular perspective, in regards to homosexual acts, it is not the best because, of course, it does not produce children. And actually, the science suggests that if a child has 2 mothers or 2 fathers, then they potentially do not grow up as well as 1 mother and 1 father, like together, I mean, as well. So I also think, in a way, society is structured as well, pushing the philosophies of not homosexuality by itself, but the whole LGBT agenda as well. It opens up multiple holes, and it basically makes the whole thing viewed as subjective. It kind of like nullifies the marriage between a husband and a wife, potentially. In fact, now today we were discussing on the first episode on marriage and divorce. How marriage has gone from being kind of like a covenant that can't be broken to being like a no commitment contract kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of like philosophies used kind of can contribute to that.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of progressive Christians, so-called progressive Christians, sorry, and people who call themselves liberals, often argue that the church should change its view and change its stance on this subject for being on the wrong side of history, so they'd say, and also fighting for so-called traditional values. However, when we've looked at it, and as we've seen today, it's actually these homosexual practices that are the traditional values that go back to like ancient times. Said the idea of not doing homosexual acts pretty much was quite very much unique to Israel and the Christians. And as we've also seen, you know, the ancient society held homosexual acts to the highest degree, and in fact they even encouraged, you know, domination of young people through homosexual BDSM acts, and even the raping of slaves and the raping of enemies and prisoners and so on. And just trying to prove that kind of like history actually proves the exact opposite of the church being caught on the wrong side of history. In fact, that the church's sexual morality is one reason it grew so explosively in the early centuries, especially being popular amongst women. So, for example, in the surrounding Roman society, women in general had very little status, whereas freeborn men married wives to obtain legal heirs, but it was accepted that they would seek sexual satisfaction with girlfriends, mistresses, prostitutes, courtesans, other men, as well as household slaves, both male and female, adults and minors, although typically post-puberty adolescents and teens. And so you can see how wives had to compete with a host of other people for their husband's love and attention. And in fact, apparently, it's been recorded that the most infidelity took the form of the men sleeping with their own slaves. For example, Horace remembers that a man would vent his sexual energies on his slave because they were readily available. If, quote, there is a slave girl or a homegrown slave boy ready at hand whom you could jump right away, why not? He adds, quote, I like sex that is easy and obtainable, close quote. And so when we look at the historical records, it was shown that the wives very often complained about their husband's unfaithfulness, but it did little good. And so wives had a natural tendency to want to be more loyal to their husbands, as to the husbands to the wives, by the looks of it. In fact, a first century Roman poet even chastises wives for being jealous when their husbands have sex with slave boys. He admonishes wives to accept the fact that, quote, intercourse is more pleasurable with boys than it is with women, close quote. And so you can see, for example, why the god of love, Cupid, was portrayed as a boy in society. But yeah, you can imagine probably St. Paul had to deal with this kind of stuff as well, really. So from the beginning, Christians have not defended traditional values, but instead they've actually stood for truth against prevailing cultural norms. And the church throughout history may have been said to be on the wrong side of history, but that is the exact reason it has changed history. And Christianity was really radical because it channeled male sexual desire into marriage as the only acceptable outlet. With, for example, in Hebrews 13, chapter 13, verse 4, it says, let marriage be held in honour among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. And even, he also says in the Ten Commandments, you shall not covet your neighbour's wives, and so on. And so the moral law of monogamy essentially means to each his own. A wife does not then have to compete. Sorry, I just yelled. With others for her husband's love. So can you see why women were especially kind of like attracted to Christianity? In fact, the Didache condemns what it calls the corrupting of boys. which is a common term for pederasty. In fact, John Chrysostom warns that the status of women is reduced when males are seen as appropriate objects of erotic desire, saying, quote, "Women are in danger of being superfluous when young men take their place in every activity. Athenagoras of Athens urges Christians not to be like their pagan neighbours who, quote, set up a market for fornication and establish infamous resorts for the young for every kind of vile pleasure, who do not abstain even from males. Males with males committing shocking abominations, outraging all the noblest and comeliest bodies in all sorts of way, so dishonouring the fair workmanship of God." And I think a really good quote there is where he says that the male-to-male relations dishonours the quote fair male workmanship of God. And we can see how the biblical worldview honours the human body as God's workmanship. And we can see how the church fathers rooted their opposition to same-sex relations in the creational theology of that in early Genesis, early on in the book of Genesis, where it says that one man leaves his mother and father to be joined in one with his wife, and they become one flesh. But anyway, we should probably actually address how the church should deal with this kind of stuff and how the church should be welcoming. It's often said that the church is a hospital for the wounded and a barracks for the strong. And the church should really be open to this and to be welcoming to people who think they're homosexual and people who do commit homosexual acts. And they should understand where these people are coming from, but also to explain kind of like the biblical viewpoint as well, and to share the high viewpoint of both the male and the female body as well. And in no way in this episode, I just want to clarify this here. Are we calling people who practice homosexual acts as evil or derogatory or anything along the lines? We're specifically talking about like the homosexual acts here. And, of course, you are still loved. It's just that homosexual acts are as much as a sin as many other things. I just think that in the 21st century, society has basically turned homosexuality into kind of like an idol that can't be touched. And if you do so much, just prod it with a stick, then they'll release the hounds on you. And so in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And I think this verse really says it so well, is that when we understand and gain a knowledge of the ways of God, we will understand why certain sins are wrong and what is right, and that our minds will be renewed, and that through testing we may know what is the will of God, and that we may practice what is good, what is acceptable, and what is perfect. And I would say to that really is that even if you are born homosexual and there's nothing you can do to change it, then you can work to understand why homosexual acts are wrong. And we would hope that we've covered that, at least introduced that kind of aspect in this episode, and that you can very well live for Jesus, and that you can live for God, much like Saint Paul was not married, for example, and has actually said that really if you stay single, then you can do more work for God, and you can do more to spread the faith, and it's a different kind of relationship with God, and you can have relationships with the people of the church and the people of the community. And you're by no means held as a lesser person. You're in fact equal, and you are still loved. And I think as Christians, we must constantly remind ourselves that our own character is in many ways fallen and disordered, and that we have just as much capacity for sin as anyone else. And I think really that is where Christians have fallen short in a lot of cases. We should hold up a moral idea for sexuality in general that should have nothing to do with pride or self-righteousness, but that it stems from the conviction that certain acts are healthier and more fulfilling because they are in line with the way God created humanity, and that the church itself should aspire to be a community that welcomes the outcast and marginalised, and that we should really welcome everybody, really, because we've got to recognise that really loneliness can also push people into like same-sex enclaves and various other philosophies of society like transgenderism and even abortion and so on. And we also have a responsibility as Christians that we should create structures in which celibate singles can enjoy committed relationships and express non-sexual affections. We've also got to recognise that those who have suffered from sexual issues in general have more often than not suffered very much, and that they've had to work through their Christianity from the ground up, and that can be one heck of a challenge. And when we do that, we often make more sacrifices than most, and have had to dig very deeply spiritually for our relationship with God.
I agree. I think we should end on this note as well, that how does this tie into the series that we're doing? And I think, in my opinion, this is just another step in this series of the degradation of culture. Not necessarily people becoming more aware of homosexuality. That's not the bad step. It's more to do, again, with the marriage laws, etc., and how homosexual marriage is another hit to an old human institution, Christian institution in our Western countries. So this is nothing. This is not to take away from what you just said about homosexual people per se, and it's not. And my point isn't saying that more homosexual people in the world means the degradation of culture. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying these laws and this culture change where marriage isn't seen as something between a man and a woman for a family, as the Romans even saw it. That's the point that connects this to the series.
Yeah. I think one of the finest achievements that the church has done, and hopefully will do in the future ever more so as well, is to be able to be such a family made up of all kinds of people, whether that be normal working software developers, builders, armed forces members, but also people like ex-paedophiles or homosexuals or transgenders, and that whole breadth of people of all races, of all kind of like cases of brokenness, because we all are broken and we all are made well in Christ, and that we are so much of a family that outsiders look at us and say the same thing that they really said of the early church, saying, "Behold how they love one another." And I'd just like to finish off the episode there. And we understand that this is a very deep subject, and especially due to the times and the nature, it's very challenging to talk about and very controversial to talk about. And we'd also like to reaffirm again that we're not talking down the person, but we're talking down the act, and that that God does indeed did love you, and that he he wants to have that relationship with you. And by all means, we hope you've learned something and taken away something from this episode. And we hope that you will stick around for the next episode, which will be on transgenderism. So thank you all very much for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again.